Often people judge others by their appearance without thinking about what is behind it. They believe that status and money determine a person's worth until life puts them in a situation that forces them to reconsider their own beliefs. In a first-class airport, one of the passengers thought he was superior to others until he encountered someone who did not fit his stereotypes. Little did he know that this flight would teach him a lesson he would never forget. Los Angeles International Airport was as bustling as ever. Business people, families, and solo travelers moved through the vast terminal, some in a rush, others taking their time. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the sterility of the polished floors, the distant hum of announcements blending into the chatter of passengers. Among them, standing in the priority boarding line for first class, was a man who seemed to defy the usual image of wealth and luxury. Mike Tyson stood in line, clad in a simple black hoodie, loose sweatpants, and a pair of worn sneakers. He carried a modest backpack slung over one shoulder, a travel companion that looked like it had seen its fair share of trips. His demeanor was calm, almost serene, as he surveyed the crowd around him, his broad shoulders relaxed, his expression neutral. A few passengers glanced at him with mild curiosity, but no one dared to say anything. At least, not yet. Behind him stood Henry Vanders, a man whose very presence demanded attention. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit with gold cufflinks and Italian leather shoes that gleamed under the airport lights, Henry radiated wealth and status. His slick-back hair and sharp jawline only added to the aura of a man who had spent his entire life knowing he was better than most. And he wanted the world to know it too. As Henry adjusted his Rolex, his gaze fell upon the man in front of him. His brows furrowed slightly, and a smirk played on his lips. "Excuse me," he said in a voice that dripped with condescension, "but are you sure you're in the right line? This is priority boarding for first class." Mike turned his head slightly, giving Henry a calm but unreadable look. His dark eyes studied the man for a moment before he simply nodded. "Yeah, right line." Henry let out a quiet chuckle and shook his head. "Huh, didn't expect to see someone like you here." Mike didn't react. He had encountered men like Henry before, men who believed the world belonged to them and that others were merely intruders in their grand domain. He had learned long ago that their words held no weight unless he gave them power. "First time flying like this?" Henry continued, determined to get some kind of reaction. "Must be quite the experience for you." Mike let the comment hang in the air for a moment before answering. "Not really. I fly like this all the time." Henry's smirk widened. "Really? Didn't peg you for the type who could afford it." Mike shrugged. "Life's full of surprises." The gate attendant called for first-class boarding, and the line began to move. Mike stepped forward at a steady pace, his movements effortless. Henry, on the other hand, strutted with practiced elegance, making sure everyone saw him as he made his way through. The flight attendants greeted them at the entrance of the plane, their smiles professional but warm. Mike gave them a polite nod as he made his way down the aisle, looking for his seat. The irony was almost comical when he found his seat number, right next to Henry Vanders. Henry stopped in his tracks, double-checking his ticket, as if the universe had made some kind of clerical error. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. Mike sat down, settling his backpack under the seat in front of him. He looked up and met Henry's gaze, giving him a small, knowing smile. "Looks like we're seat buddies." Henry exhaled through his nose sharply, visibly annoyed. He took his seat beside Mike, but made a point of turning slightly away, his posture stiff. It was clear that he wanted nothing more than to pretend Mike didn't exist. The cabin filled with the quiet rustling of passengers getting comfortable, the overhead compartments clicking shut one by one. The flight attendants made their way through the aisles, offering champagne to the first-class passengers. Henry accepted his with a smug nod. "A glass of your finest, please," he said, making sure to emphasize the words as if he were at an exclusive gala. When the attendant turned to Mike, he simply said, "Water's fine." Henry turned his head slightly, unable to resist another jab. "Water? In first class? Come on, man, live a little. This is supposed to be a luxury experience." Mike unscrewed the cap of his water bottle and took a slow sip before replying. "Sometimes simple things are enough." Henry let out a short, amused breath. Yeah, well, some of us prefer the finer things. But I guess not everyone's cut out for that. Mike didn't bother responding. He had long ago learned that silence could be a more powerful response than words. But Henry wasn't done. So, what do you do? He asked, feigning casual interest but with a tone that made it clear he expected a predictable answer. Mike finished another sip of water before answering. I used to fight. Henry chuckled. Let me guess, underground fights? Maybe some low-rent boxing gym gigs? I mean, you do have the build for it. Mike turned his head slightly, his eyes steady. Something like that. Henry shook his head with a smirk. Yeah, I figured. You know, real success isn't about throwing punches. It's about using your mind, building an empire. That's how you make real money. People like you? You're just entertainment for people like me. Mike looked at him for a long moment, then simply nodded. That's so? Absolutely, Henry continued, leaning back in his seat, crossing his arms. Some people are just meant to be in first class. Others, well, they get lucky every once in a while. Mike didn't react, but he could hear the subtle shifts around them. The other passengers were listening. They weren't saying anything, but they were aware. And as Henry continued to talk, oblivious to the stares he was beginning to attract, Mike remained as composed as ever. Henry took another sip of his champagne, clearly feeling superior. You know, life's about status. If you don't have it, you're nobody. That's just how the world works. Mike set his water bottle down on the tray table and finally spoke, his voice as calm as ever. Or maybe real status isn't about what you own, but how you treat people. For the first time since the conversation began, Henry hesitated. His smirk faltered just slightly before he quickly recovered. Yeah, that's something poor people say to feel better about themselves. Real power is in wealth. Mike just gave a small smile and turned his gaze back to the window. The flight had only just begun, but Henry didn't realize yet that he was the one about to get an education. And soon, he would learn exactly who he had been talking down to all this time. As the plane settled into cruising altitude, the hum of the engines filled the cabin. First-class passengers leaned back in their plush seats, some sipping on expensive drinks, others browsing their devices. Henry Vanders, feeling secure in his perceived dominance, crossed his legs and took another sip of his champagne, eyeing Mike Tyson with the same condescending smirk he had worn since the boarding gate. So, Henry continued, turning slightly toward Mike. You never answered my question properly. What do you actually do now? Since, fighting isn't exactly a career that lasts forever. Mike slowly turned his head to meet Henry's gaze, his expression unreadable. I do a few things here and there. Investments, businesses, charities. Henry let out a quiet chuckle. Businesses? Charities? That's cute. You really think that's how you build an empire? Let me tell you something, Tyson, real power comes from controlling assets. From making sure every dollar you own is making you more dollars. Not from throwing money at charity just to feel good about yourself. Mike said nothing, simply watching the man as he continued to speak, his confidence growing with each word. Henry clearly believed he was delivering some grand lesson about success to a man he thought was beneath him. Take me, for example, Henry went on, adjusting his cufflinks. I built my wealth from nothing. Real estate, tech investments, international markets. That's what separates the big players from the people who just get lucky. I mean, sure, you had a good run in the ring, but that doesn't mean you understand the real game. Mike Tyson leaned back in his seat, folding his hands in his lap. He had spent years mastering patience, learning that silence often spoke louder than words. He knew that men like Henry lived for validation, for the belief that they were the smartest person in the room. The flight attendant approached again, offering another round of drinks. Henry took another champagne, while Mike stuck with his water. The contrast wasn't lost on those around them. Passengers in nearby seats had begun to notice the tension. They exchanged glances, some subtly tilting their heads to listen in. Henry noticed too. He enjoyed an audience. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it seem like he was giving Mike some privileged advice. Look, I get it. Some people come from nothing and get lucky. They make a name for themselves, but they don't know what to do after. And then, there are people like me, who understand how the world really works, who build lasting wealth, real influence. That's why I'm here, and why people like you, well, they come and go. Mike's gaze never wavered. He took a slow sip of water, set the bottle down carefully, and finally spoke. You think money makes you powerful? Henry scoffed. Of course. What else is there? Power is money. Status. Control. If you don't have that, you're nobody. Mike exhaled slowly and nodded. You know, I used to believe that too. He leaned in slightly, mirroring Henry's posture. When I was young, I thought power was about how hard you could hit, how much fear you could put in someone. And later, I thought it was about how much money you could make. But I learned something. Henry raised an eyebrow, intrigued but still skeptical. Oh yeah? And what's that? Mike's voice remained calm, almost too calm. Power isn't about what you have. It's about what you can walk away from and still be the same man. For the first time, Henry's smirk faltered. It was subtle, but it was there. A shift in his confidence. He quickly masked it with another sip of champagne, but the moment wasn't lost on those who were watching. That's a nice little quote, Henry said, forcing a chuckle. Sounds like something you'd hear in one of those self-help books. But let's be real here. People like me, we own the world. We make the rules. Mike tilted his head slightly, studying Henry like he was an opponent in the ring. You think so? He asked, his tone almost amused. I know so, Henry shot back. And that's why I don't waste my time on nonsense like humility or charity. The world isn't built for that. It's built for the strong, and the strong take what they want. Mike nodded slowly. So, tell me, Henry, what happens when you lose it all? When the money, the status, the control, when all of it disappears? Who are you then? Henry rolled his eyes. That's not going to happen. Because I built my life on intelligence and strategy, not brute force. Mike chuckled softly, shaking his head. You ever been punched in the face, Henry? The question caught Henry off guard. He blinked, momentarily thrown off. What? I asked if you've ever been punched in the face, Mike repeated, his tone casual but firm. Because I have. A lot. And let me tell you something. It teaches you real quick what's real and what's not. What you can handle and what you can't. Money doesn't prepare you for that. Status doesn't prepare you for that. Only experience does. Henry straightened his posture, shifting slightly in his seat. Look, I don't need to get punched in the face to know how the world works. Mike smiled. Maybe not. But sooner or later, life hits everybody. And when it does, we see who's really strong. Silence settled between them for a moment. Henry glanced around, noticing more passengers watching now. He felt the weight of their gazes, the shift in the energy around them. His confidence, which had seemed so unshakable minutes ago, wasn't feeling as solid anymore. Just then, the flight attendant returned. But this time, she wasn't just offering drinks. She held a note in her hand and addressed Mike with a warm smile. Mr. Tyson, she said, the captain wanted to personally welcome you on board and thank you for everything you've done. He's a big fan. Henry's face turned pale. The name Tyson finally registered fully in his mind. The murmurs around them increased as other passengers realized who had been sitting there the entire time. Henry swallowed hard. Wait, you're Mike Tyson? Mike gave him a slow nod. That's what they tell me. The color drained from Henry's face. The man he had been belittling, the one he had assumed was beneath him, was one of the most legendary fighters in history. A man whose reputation far exceeded anything Henry had ever accomplished. Passengers began whispering, some glancing at Henry with barely concealed amusement. A couple even smirked, shaking their heads at the irony of it all. Henry's mouth opened, then closed again. He struggled to find words, but for once he had none. Mike leaned back, taking another sip of water, completely unfazed. Still think power is about money? He asked, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a lesson Henry would never forget. Henry didn't answer. He couldn't. Because in that moment, as he sat there drowning in humiliation, he realized that Mike Tyson had just knocked him out, without even throwing a punch. Henry Vanders sat in stunned silence, his fingers tightening around the stem of his champagne glass. The weight of realization pressed down on him like a boulder. The man he had spent the last hour belittling was none other than Mike Tyson, a legend, an icon, a name that held more power in a single syllable than all the wealth Henry had accumulated over his years of corporate conquest. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Some exchanged amused glances. Others whispered to their seatmates about the unexpected spectacle. Henry felt their eyes on him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt small. Mike, on the other hand, remained composed. He had seen this reaction before. He had lived through a lifetime of people underestimating him, making assumptions about him based on appearance, fame, or past mistakes. It didn't bother him anymore. The only difference now was that Henry was facing the truth, and the truth had a way of humbling even the proudest of men. The flight attendant, still standing nearby, waited for a response from Mike, but he simply nodded and thanked her. She smiled and moved on, leaving Henry trapped in the weight of his own words. Henry cleared his throat, forcing a nervous chuckle. I had no idea. Mike turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Would it have changed anything? Henry opened his mouth, but hesitated. The truth was, it would have changed everything. He wouldn't have spoken down to him. He wouldn't have dismissed him as someone who didn't belong. He would have treated him with the respect that his name commanded. And that, in itself, was the problem. I suppose it would, Henry admitted, his voice quieter now. I mean, you're Mike Tyson. Mike gave a small nod. And before you knew that, Henry exhaled, his fingers now fidgeting with the sleeve of his suit. I judged you, made assumptions. I thought I knew everything just because I had money, because I had built something. But I see now, that was arrogance. Mike studied him for a long moment before speaking. I used to think power was about being the biggest guy in the room, about making people fear me. But I learned that real power is about respect. And respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. Henry looked down at his drink, feeling an unfamiliar sensation creeping into his chest. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was regret. Not just for what he had said to Mike, but for the years he had spent living under the illusion that money equated to worth. I spent my whole life trying to prove that I was better than everyone else, Henry admitted, that I belonged at the top. But now I realize I've been measuring the wrong things. Mike leaned back in his seat, nodding slowly. Success is tricky. It can make you feel like you're invincible. But sooner or later, life humbles everyone. The real question is whether you learn from it. Henry exhaled deeply, then chuckled. A genuine, self-deprecating chuckle this time. I guess I just got humbled at 40,000 feet. Mike grinned. Better late than never. The tension between them began to ease, replaced by something different. Understanding. Henry, for the first time in years, felt like he wasn't just talking at someone, but actually listening. As the flight continued, the conversation between the two men shifted. No longer adversarial, but reflective. Henry asked Mike about his life, what it was like to walk away from boxing, what he had learned from his highs and lows. And Mike, in return, listened to Henry's story, how he had built his fortune, the sacrifices he had made, the relationships he had lost along the way. By the time the plane began its descent, Henry had come to a conclusion he never thought he'd reach. I always thought people needed to see my success to respect me. But maybe it's not about that at all. Maybe it's about how I treat people when I don't think they can do anything for me. Mike smiled. That's the real test. The seatbelt sign illuminated, and the passengers around them prepared for landing. Henry, feeling lighter than he had in years, extended a hand toward Mike. Thank you, he said, sincerity in his eyes. Not just for the lesson, but for not knocking me out when I probably deserved it. Mike laughed and shook his hand. You took the hit in a different way, man, and you handled it just fine. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Henry knew that he was walking off that flight a different man than when he had boarded. And for the first time in a long time, he was grateful. Not for his money, not for his status, but for a lesson that had cost him nothing and yet changed everything. The plane taxied to the gate, and the passengers began gathering their belongings. Henry Vanders, for the first time in years, wasn't in a rush to push past others to be the first off the plane. Instead, he sat still for a moment, staring at his reflection in the darkened airplane window, reflecting on the past few hours that had so unexpectedly shaken his perspective on life. Mike Tyson stretched his shoulders, an easygoing demeanor still about him, as if he had spent the flight in pure comfort while Henry had been through a battlefield of his own making. Henry glanced at him again, still amazed by the effortless composure Tyson carried. The seatbelt light turned off with a soft chime, and movement filled the first-class cabin. People retrieved bags, exchanged small talk, and prepared to leave. Henry, feeling a sudden need to continue the conversation, turned to Mike one last time. "Mike," he said, hesitating for a fraction of a second, "I just want to say, I don't think I'll ever forget this flight." Mike gave him a small smile, his gaze steady. "That's good, man. Lessons like these don't come often. What matters is what you do with it." Henry let those words settle as he stood, adjusting his suit jacket. He had spent years crafting the perfect image of success, but for the first time, he wondered if he had missed the point all along. As the first-class passengers disembarked, Henry found himself walking alongside Mike down the jet bridge. A few other passengers gave Tyson respectful nods or murmured greetings, and he acknowledged them all with simple but sincere gestures. Henry, meanwhile, was noticing something unusual. People weren't looking at him the way they normally did. He had spent years ensuring that when he walked into a room, people recognized his importance. But now no one seemed to care, and strangely, he found he didn't mind. "So what now?" Henry asked, his tone more curious than skeptical. Mike turned to him with an amused expression. "For you? That's up to you." Henry exhaled, shaking his head with a chuckle. "I've spent my whole life thinking I had it all figured out, but I think this flight just taught me otherwise." Mike nodded knowingly. "That's the thing about life, man. The second you think you've got it all, it reminds you that you don't." They stepped into the terminal, the sound of luggage wheels rolling against polished floors filling the space. The massive airport was a sea of travelers, each lost in their own world. Henry had walked through airports like this 100 times before, always with the same confident stride, always feeling above the crowd. But today he felt different. As they reached the baggage claim, a small group of people had gathered, clearly recognizing Mike. Some approached cautiously, asking for a picture or a handshake. Mike obliged each one, taking the time to speak to them, even cracking a few jokes. Henry watched in silence, absorbing every interaction. One young man in his 20s approached Tyson, nervous but determined. "Mr. Tyson, I just want to say, you were my dad's hero. He always told me stories about your fights. He passed away last year, but I know he would have loved to meet you." Mike's face softened, and he reached out, placing a firm but gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "That means a lot, man. I appreciate you telling me that. I'm sure your dad was a great guy." The young man nodded, smiling through what looked like the beginning of tears. He shook Mike's hand firmly before stepping away. Henry felt something stir inside him, an unfamiliar feeling of genuine admiration. Mike didn't have to do that. He could have brushed off the moment, walked away, let his status keep him untouchable. But he didn't. He chose to engage, to acknowledge, to give something real. Henry had spent years surrounded by people who only cared about the next deal, the next financial conquest. No one in his circle had time for moments like this. It was all about power, and in that world, kindness was often seen as weakness. But now, watching Mike, he realized the opposite was true. The baggage carousel started moving, and Henry spotted his designer suitcase among the first to emerge. He stepped forward, lifting it off with ease, but his mind was elsewhere. When he turned back, Mike was already grabbing his own modest duffel bag, worn, simple, and without a single trace of extravagance. For a man who had once held the title of the most feared fighter on the planet, Mike Tyson was shockingly unpretentious. Henry felt a pang of something close to shame when he thought about his own lifestyle, his need to flaunt, to make sure people knew who he was and what he had. Mike had nothing to prove, and yet he was the one who truly commanded respect. "I have to ask," Henry said as they walked toward the exit. "You could live like a king. Private jets, $1,000,000 watches, everything. But you don't. Why?" Mike's smile was subtle but knowing. "Because I already had all that, and at the end of the day, none of it mattered." Henry frowned. "But isn't success about—" "Success," Mike interrupted gently, "is about what you leave behind, not what you take with you." Henry was quiet for a moment. Those words settled in his mind like a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying. All his life, he had been accumulating, gathering, building an empire of wealth and influence. But what had he truly left behind? Outside the airport, A black luxury car was already waiting for Henry. His driver stood by the door, ready to whisk him away to whatever high-rise office or five-star hotel awaited him next. For the first time, Henry wasn't in a hurry to get there. Mike adjusted the strap of his bag. "This is where we part ways, huh?" Henry hesitated. He felt like there was still more to say, but he didn't know how to say it. "Yeah, I guess so." Mike extended a hand, and Henry shook it firmly. "Take care, Henry." Henry nodded. "You too, Mike." As he watched Tyson walk away, disappearing into the sea of travelers, Henry Vanders knew that he had been changed. Not by a business deal, not by another zero added to his bank account, but by a simple conversation with a man who had nothing to prove and everything to teach. As he climbed into his luxury car, Henry stared out the window, lost in thought. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to start measuring success differently.